December 1943. 25,000 feet above northern Germany, a single B-17 drifts behind its formation, trailing smoke and frost crystals that shimmer in the thin air. One engine is out, another fading. Inside the fuselage, oxygen hoses hiss and metal groans under the cold. Below, 6 dots rise from the haze, BF-109S and FW-190S climbing for the kill. The crew brace for impact, cut off from escort and radio. The first attack tears through the sky. Tracers streak upward from the tail in an arc no manual ever taught. The fighters misjudge the pattern. Their shells pass low, their dives too shallow. For a moment, the bomber holds steady, shaking but alive. In the tail compartment, Sergeant James Reeves squeezes the triggers of his twin .50 calibers, tilting them higher than regulation allows. His mask frosts, his gloves stiffen, but his rhythm stays exact. 3 round bursts. Pause, correction, repeat. One fighter bursts into smoke and falls away. When the air finally clears, the fortress still flies, riddled, leaking, but level. The crew stare at the frozen horizon, unable to explain why they survived. Only Reeves knows. What they had called his stupid elevation trick had rewritten the geometry of death and turned one doomed bomber into a fortress that refused to fall. In 1943, the 8th Air Force believed precision and formation could overcome anything. Every bomber crew trained under the same rigid doctrine: fly tight, fire level, and let the geometry of massed guns build an impenetrable wall. Gunnery manuals warned that any deviation, especially barrel elevation, was wasteful, even dangerous. The B-17's strength, instructors insisted, came from order, not improvisation. At Wendover, Tonopah, and Las Vegas gunnery schools, recruits practiced behind red lines painted on turret yokes. "Keep your barrels level," instructors repeated. "Fire flat and conserve ammo." Charts showed perfect intersections of tracer paths, lines that promised mathematical safety. But in real combat, those clean diagrams broke apart. Luftwaffe pilots no longer attacked from behind. They came head-on, diving steeply through the narrow frontal gap the manuals ignored. Losses climbed with every raid. Nearly 1 in 5 fortresses failed to return from missions over the Ruhr. Survivors spoke of flashes appearing too late, of fighters rising faster than their tracers could climb. Some gunners blamed nerves, others blamed luck. A few quietly blamed the rule itself. Among them was a young machinist-turned-gunner named James Reeves. He had seen those patterns firsthand: the missed shots, the disappearing targets, the helpless seconds before impact. On the ground, he studied the tail turret the way a mechanic studies a broken gear. The stop bolts, the elevation locks, the range tables, all designed to keep men safe by limiting what they could try. During night maintenance shifts, Reeves began adjusting small details. He filed the elevation stop by a few millimeters, just enough to push the twin .50S higher. To most, it meant nothing. To him, it changed the equation. He wanted his bullets to meet the enemy before the enemy met him. Fellow crewmen laughed. "You'll shoot at clouds," one said. "They'll court-martial you if they see that." Reeves shrugged. "Maybe clouds are where they're coming from." His untested idea earned a nickname whispered half in jest, the stupid elevation trick. But to Reeves, the logic was simple. If German fighters attacked from above, then firing flat was suicide. The only way to survive was to tilt the rule itself. By December, his group at Thorpe Abbotts prepared for another deep strike, Bremen through weather and flak. As the crew of KDD loaded ammunition and checked oxygen lines, Reeves made one last adjustment to the filed-down lock. The airfield lights flickered over the frost on the guns. For the first time, his barrels pointed not at the horizon, but slightly toward the future. The B-17F KDD of the 305th Bomb Group carried 12 missions worth of scars. Patchwork aluminum covered the fuselage where flak had bitten through. One engine had been replaced twice. The crew treated her like an aging prizefighter, still powerful, but held together by habit and tape. On paper, she was combat-ready. In truth, she was a veteran on borrowed air. Sergeant James Reeves manned her tail turret. At 24, he was quiet, methodical, and obsessed with machinery. Before the war, he'd been a machinist, used to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. To him, the twin .50 caliber Brownings were not just weapons, they were instruments. He studied vibration, recoil, and alignment the way others studied enemy silhouettes. Accuracy, he believed, wasn't instinct, it was geometry. By autumn 1943, that geometry was failing. German fighters had adapted faster than manuals could update. Instead of trailing attacks, they now charged from head-on or below, exploiting dead zones the bombers couldn't cover. The flat-fire rule, once doctrine, had become a death sentence. Reeves watched it happen raid after raid, tracers streaking harmlessly beneath enemy aircraft while cannon shells tore through friendlies ahead. The fortress wall had cracks, and no one wanted to admit it. After the Bremen mission in November, Reeves spent a night alone with his turret. He loosened the elevation stop and filed it down. The modification was small, barely a sliver of metal shaved away, but it unlocked an extra 8 degrees of upward movement. He didn't tell anyone. It was technically illegal. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of those steep-angled attacks where he'd fired perfectly, and still missed. If the Luftwaffe wouldn't play by the book, why should he? During a training flight days later, Reeves tested his new range. A towed sleeve target passed 300 yards above, simulating a climbing fighter. He aimed high and fired in short bursts. His tracers arched cleanly into the sleeve, tearing it apart. The observers below assumed luck. Reeves knew better. He had found his angle. Lieutenant Harris, the pilot, noticed the modification during inspection. "You filed this?" he asked. Reeves nodded. "It hits where they dive from." Harris frowned. "You understand why that's against procedure?" Reeves smiled faintly. "Only if I miss." The officer said nothing more. Rules mattered less when luck ran thin. By dawn on the 11th of December, KTD was scheduled for another run on Bremen, one of the most defended industrial targets in Germany. The 8th Air Force sent 300 bombers that morning, each carrying 6,000 pounds of ordnance. Fighter escort would cover only halfway. Beyond that, they'd be alone. Engines roared to life across Thorpe Abbots. Frost clung to wings like thin glass. Reeves checked his oxygen lines, rotated the turret, and felt the smooth resistance of the filed lock. It moved cleanly, obediently, waiting. Takeoff came in pairs. The formation climbed through scattered cloud into sunlight, contrails weaving into white ribbons. The air temperature dropped below 40 C. Every joint in the bomber froze stiff. Every movement became deliberate. Reeves scanned the horizon through the sight, noting the shimmer of distant escorts. P-47S keeping station until their fuel forced them home. He calculated the hour they'd turn back. After that, the sky would belong to the Luftwaffe. The first attack came earlier than expected. At 24,000 feet over the Weser Valley, 6 Bf-109 G6S appeared head-on. Formation discipline held. Gunners opened fire as briefed. Tracers crossed the air too low, burning out before reaching the targets. 2 bombers exploded within seconds. Reeves adjusted his sight 1 degree higher. The next pair came in steep, guns flashing. He waited until they filled the reticle, then fired, not flat, but high. His tracers arched upward into their climb. One fighter rolled sharply, smoke spilling from its engine. The other broke off in confusion, passing harmlessly below. "Good hit, Tail," Harris shouted. Reeves didn't reply. He was already adjusting again, timing bursts to match their angles. Each second mattered. Each second stretched like a lifetime. The fortress shook as flak burst nearby, but his rhythm stayed constant. Short, disciplined, mechanical. By the time they crossed Bremen, the formation had scattered. 2 engines on KTD were damaged, 1 feathered. The bomber lagged half a mile behind the others, alone, wounded, a clear mark for pursuit. Reeves turned his guns toward the sun, watching new specks form above the horizon. He knew what came next, the circling approach, the slow, tightening spiral that always ended the same way. Only this time he had the angle. He lifted the barrels past the red mark he'd erased, exhaled, and squeezed. His tracers cut through empty air and met the lid fighter squarely in its climb. The 109 burst apart, wings shearing away. The others scattered. Inside the cockpit, no one spoke. Harris banked gently west, searching for the channel. Reeves remained at his post, eyes fixed on the retreating dots. He hadn't changed the war, just one rule. But at 25,000 feet over Bremen, that was enough to keep 9 men alive. The bomber was falling behind. Over Bremen, KDD had taken 2 hits, one through the left stabilizer, one grazing the number 3 engine cowling. Exhaust smoke trailed in gray spirals against the thin blue sky. The formation was already a distant scatter of dots ahead, shrinking toward the horizon. The escorts had turned home an hour earlier. The crew knew what that meant. They were bait now, a single fortress adrift in enemy airspace. At 25,000 feet, the air shimmered with frost. Inside, condensation froze across the plexiglass. The interphone crackled with static. Only fragments of voices cut through. Reeves adjusted the turret's elevation, breathing through a mask stiff with ice. Below, the city of Bremen burned in dull orange patches, its smoke rising into the slipstream. The fortress climbed slightly to clear the flak, then leveled. Silence returned, broken only by the pulse of dying engines. Then Reeves saw them, 6 specks rising out of the haze, sunlight flashing on wings. BF-109S climbing in pairs from the blind zone of the low sun. He watched their formation tighten, climbing at the same measured angle he had studied for months. It was ritual, precise and merciless, the high-angle roll, the slashing dive, the upward climb behind the bomber. Once a formation broke, it was slaughter. "Bandits, 6 high," Reeves called into the headset. Static swallowed his words. The waist gunners searched empty sky. He adjusted the turret, setting the barrels just above the red line, his line now. The first pair struck from the 12 o'clock high, curving into a shallow dive. Reeves tracked the lead and fired long, disciplined bursts. His tracers climbed in a golden arc that met their path midway. The lead fighter jerked abruptly, shells passing below. The second pilot broke left, his burst cutting wide. Reeves kept firing, the recoil hammering through his shoulders. One fighter flamed briefly and vanished into cloud. The interphone hissed alive. "Tail, keep that line! They're regrouping!" It was Harris, calm but strained. Reeves grunted acknowledgement and swapped ammunition belts. Frost cracked around the loading hatch. He could barely feel his fingers. The remaining 4 circled higher, taking position for the second pass. They would come from opposite sides this time, 10 and 2 o'clock high, to divide his field of fire. Reeves steadied his breath and waited. Through his gun sight, the world narrowed to 2 converging dots. The attack came fast. Cannon shells streaked past the fuselage, ripping metal and cloth. KDD shuddered. Reeves swung the turret left, then high again, timing each burst by feel. His tracers crossed the space between the fighters, invisible geometry forming in motion. One 109 peeled away smoking. The other rolled underneath, firing upward as it passed. Shrapnel slammed into the tail, jolting Reeves against the armor plate. He checked the cables, still intact, no fire. He resumed the arc, breathing in rhythm with the turret's movement. Each burst lasted no more than 3 seconds. The guns glowed dull red at the muzzles. The air smelled of burned oil. "Left stabilizer hit," shouted the waist gunner. Harris replied, "Hold altitude, don't break." They all knew a dive meant instant death. In formation, they would have shared protection. Alone, their safety depended entirely on the math Reeves was writing in the sky. Another pair appeared from below, climbing hard. Reeves anticipated their vector, elevated 2 more degrees, and fired before they reached the line of sight. The fighters tried to roll under his tracers, but misjudged again. Their shells burst harmlessly beneath the fuselage, gouging only air. He felt something close to calm. Fear had turned to focus, each calculation unfolding without thought. Let angle, bullet drop, closing speed. The filed-down lock had freed more than his guns. It had freed his logic. For the first time since Bremen, the fighters broke off. They formed a wide circle in the distance, wary, uncertain. Reeves seized the chance to reload. He opened the feed cover and swapped belts with mechanical precision. His gloves were stiff, his fingers numb, yet the movements stayed perfect. "Tail, report," Harris asked. Reeves answered, "Still here. They're watching." "They'll come again," Harris said. "We'll give them altitude." He eased the throttles back, letting the fortress drift down toward 22,000 feet. The airframe trembled as cold air thickened around it. Reeves scanned the sky. For a moment, he saw nothing but vapor trails dissolving into glare. Then, movement. 3 shapes, larger now, closing fast from the high right quadrant. FW-190S, faster and heavier than the 109S, diving with intent. He locked the turret and waited until their wingtips aligned, then fired. His tracers climbed like a ladder through sunlight. The lead 190 hesitated, pulling up too soon. The second followed, firing wildly, its shells splitting the air above the cockpit. The third pressed on, cannon blazing. Reeves held steady, elevating another degree. The fighter's silhouette grew until the nose filled his sight. He squeezed both triggers and saw a sudden flash, then black smoke spiraling away. The remaining 2 disappeared into the sun. Reeves exhaled slowly. Inside the fuselage, someone murmured a half-prayer. Below them stretched a wasteland of cloud and smoke. The bomber held altitude, but fuel was bleeding faster now. The oxygen gauge flickered. Reeves ignored it. He couldn't afford distraction. He had one job, to hold that high invisible shield that only he could see. Far behind, the sky shimmered again. More specks, another wave forming. Reeves lifted his guns, steady and precise, the barrels pointing past the red lines burned into every other gunner's memory. His breath fogged the glass. He whispered to himself, "All right, let's try again." The fortress was no longer just a target. It was a moving equation of speed, angle, and defiance. One man's refusal to accept the rules written for his own destruction. The new wave came hard and organized. 3 FW-190S in stepped formation, 1 high, 2 flanking, each pilot trained for the kill. Their cannon flashes sparked like brief suns against the cold horizon. KDD was already bleeding altitude, her right wing shaking from a frayed spar. Harris tried to hold her steady while Reeves tracked the converging paths through the sight, every movement deliberate, every breath counted. The lead fighter opened fire first, shells streaking wide. Reeves waited, then raised his barrels past regulation, firing above the canopy line. His tracers curved upward, invisible ladders across the sky. The German pulled too soon, fooled by the deceptive arc. One burst connected. The fighter wobbled, clipped its wingman's slipstream, and both broke formation. But the sky didn't clear. Another pair appeared higher, climbing into position for the head-on roll. Reeves shifted left, steadying the guns against the tail ring's vibration. He fired short bursts, 4 seconds on, 1 off, to keep the barrels from freezing solid. The next attack came, slicing from 2 o'clock. The fortress trembled as cannon rounds punched through the rear fuselage. Sparks erupted behind him. A control cable snapped. He ignored it. He was already tracking the second fighter climbing to finish the pass. He led early, too early, by standard tables. The tracers should have missed. Instead, they intersected perfectly with the 190's climb. The fighter flared white, then fell in a spiral of smoke. Reeves didn't cheer. He knew there were more. Harris's voice came through faint static. "Tail, what's your ammo?" Reeves glanced at the counter. 4 belts left. "Copy. We're losing manifold pressure. Keep them guessing." He wiped frost from his goggles, squinting into the glare. The sky was a patchwork of sunlight and vapor trails. The fighters regrouped above, silhouettes sharp against the haze. They were cautious now, probing, unsure. His strange, high-angled fire had broken their rhythm. The Luftwaffe pilots couldn't read the geometry. Every pass they risked diving into a space where bullets already waited. Minutes passed like hours. The fortress crept lower, engines droning unevenly. Reeves's world shrank to the turret and the shimmer of tracers. Fear no longer registered, only timing and motion. The filed-down notch in his elevation stop had erased hesitation. Every angle now belonged to him alone. Then came the final charge. 2 fighters, mirrored on both sides, closing fast from high rear. Their cannons pulsed bright orange. Reeves twisted the turret in one fluid motion, crossed his sights between them, and elevated just beyond his own line. The burst he fired looked wrong, too high, too early. But both fighters adjusted instinctively, pulling up to escape the fire. Their correction ruined the attack. The left-hand pilot rolled too far and clipped the fortress's slipstream. His wing tore away. The second dove beneath and vanished. For the first time in 30 minutes, the sky was empty. Reeves scanned the horizon twice before lowering his barrels. The gun smoked faintly, the metal breathing out its exhaustion. His gloves were frozen to the triggers. Inside, the crew spoke in half-sentences. The waist gunners reported oxygen loss. The navigator said they were crossing the Weser. The bomber had flown through a gauntlet that should have shredded it to pieces, yet the airframe held. Harris leveled out and announced, "Turning west, home." Reeves kept watching anyway. He knew Luftwaffe pilots often lingered beyond radar range, waiting for wounded stragglers. His ammunition was nearly gone, 50 rounds in one gun, a few more in the other. He decided to save 10. A machinist's instinct always keeps spares. Below, broken sunlight revealed the coastline far ahead, a silver line through haze. He dared not believe it yet. He raised his sight again, scanning. Nothing moved, only contrails fading high above where the main formation had already gone. Minutes passed, then the tail gunner's greatest enemy, silence. It carried doubt heavier than any shell. Reeves forced himself to breathe evenly, feeling the vibration of each surviving engine. Somewhere behind, one of the gunners began humming through his mask, an old country tune that barely reached the interphone. The sound felt unreal. Finally, Harris spoke. "Tail, clear astern?" Reeves hesitated, then answered, "Clear, for now." "Good. Keep eyes open till we hit the coast." "Yes, sir." He rotated the turret once more, slow and complete, then let the gun settle high, just above horizon. He didn't lower them. Superstition or logic, it didn't matter. That elevation had saved them, and he wouldn't change it until wheels touched ground. The bomber descended through pale cloud. The air thickened, the vibration eased. Reeves felt the first tremor of warmth through the metal floor. He stared at the barrels, blackened and pitted, their tips faintly smoking. They looked nothing like regulation, tilted too high, paint worn away where the lock had once held firm. He touched the filed groove with his thumb, feeling the roughness that had defied instruction. It wasn't pride he felt, nor triumph, just a steady, practical satisfaction that the idea had worked. Geometry had beaten doctrine. Outside, the last light of day glowed across the North Sea. KDD limped westward, one engine coughing, the others singing in uneven harmony. The fortress was broken, leaking, yet alive. In her wake hung faint traces of smoke and gunpowder, evidence of the battle she shouldn't have survived. As the coast drew closer, Reeves finally exhaled. He kept his eyes on the horizon, barrels still raised above the red line, waiting for something he no longer feared to appear. Nothing came. Only sea, cloud, and the slow approach of home. The stupid elevation trick had begun as defiance and ended as doctrine. And though Reeves didn't yet know it, the angle he carved that day, measured in degrees, not glory, would quietly reshape every fortress that followed, ensuring that when others fought alone, they too would aim just a little higher. The North Sea came into view as a gray shimmer beneath cloud shadow, a narrow lifeline separating survival from loss. KDD limped toward it at 18,000 feet, her frame vibrating with every turn of the wounded engines. The crew spoke little now. They had passed the point where words could help. The instruments told their story, fuel nearly gone, oil pressure fading, oxygen down to trace flow. But the sky behind was empty. No contrails, no dots, no hunters. Against all probability, the Luftwaffe had broken off. Reeves scanned the horizon one last time, the twin Brownings still elevated above the red line. His breath fogged the sight glass, but he refused to lower the barrels. Habit had fused with faith. The turret's hum was the only steady sound left. Every other rhythm, engines, interphone, heartbeat, wavered on the edge of silence. Below, the cloud deck opened for a moment. Reeves glimpsed ships cutting white wakes across a dark sea. "Convoy," he said into the mic, though no one answered. The men forward were too busy nursing the bomber's life support, coaxing fuel between tanks, managing throttle to prevent flameout. Every action was delicate, measured in ounces of pressure. When England finally appeared as a gray blur beyond the mist, the bomber had one engine at full power, one fading, and two coughing on fumes. The altimeter dropped in slow surrender. Harris guided her toward Norfolk's coastline, voice steady through the static. "Hang on, boys. Just hold her together." Reeves could feel the tension in his spine easing at last, though he didn't trust it. Survival could vanish faster than a trigger pull. They broke through the last bank of cloud, and the airfield at Thorpe Abbotts came into view, runways gleaming with frost, the control tower blinking faintly. KDD approached low and unstable. One main gear refused to lock. Harris kept her straight with both hands and the faint pull of the surviving engines. The bomber hit the runway hard, skidding through smoke and sparks. For an instant, everyone thought she'd flip. Then she slid to a stop, tilted but upright, a trail of black oil behind her. When the hatch opened, the crew stumbled out into frigid air. Groundmen ran forward shouting. They expected to find casualties. Instead, they found silence, a stunned crew breathing steam, eyes hollow but alive. Reeves stepped down last, his gloves still fused to the gun grips. He pried them loose, feeling the skin tear as the leather gave way. He looked up at the tail turret, still aimed above horizon, and whispered, "Good enough." Debriefing came that night in a small operations hut warmed by a single stove. Intelligence officers moved between tables, collecting data from returning crews. Reeves's squadron had lost 9 bombers. Theirs was the only one to make it back solo. The questions began the moment he sat down. Duration of engagement? 35 minutes. Confirmed kills? 2, possibly 3. Position during contact? Rear formation separated by 1 mile. Procedure followed? He hesitated, meeting the officer's eyes. Modified. How modified? I fired above regulation, 8 degrees over standard. The officer frowned. That's outside approved harmonization. Yes, sir, that's why it worked. The room went quiet. The pencil in the officer's hand hovered, then wrote. Experimental deviation observed. Effective. Reeves said nothing more. The session ended in 10 minutes, but the note he'd left behind began to travel. The next day, technicians inspected KDD. They found the filed-down lock on the turret's elevation stop and unusual heat wear along the upper recoil housing, proof of sustained fire at non-standard angle. The report reached the 305th Bomb Group's Gunnery Division by evening. A test memorandum followed. Evaluate elevated lead compensation for defensive turrets. For 2 weeks, the crew was grounded under technical review. Unofficially, Command wanted to confirm the impossible, that a single gunner's alteration had defeated 4 coordinated attacks. Reeves spent those days in the hangar, working beside mechanics. He spoke little, but when asked, he explained simply, "We've been firing at where they were, not where they're going." He drew diagrams on scrap cardboard, angles, trajectories, lead distances. To him, it wasn't genius, it was correction. In January 1944, test results from Wendover confirmed his field data. Raising elevation by 6 to 8 degrees increased hit probability during steep climb and head-on attacks by nearly 1/3. Gunnery manuals were revised quietly, replacing maintain level barrels with apply elevated lead under approach convergence. No credit line followed. The technique entered the system under the neutral phrase, Revised Harmonization Protocol. By spring, the new B-17G and B-24J models rolled out with modified turret brackets and extended elevation range. Factory blueprints reflected the change as if it had always existed. Crews learned it without knowing its origin. Reeves's idea had moved from defiance to doctrine in less than 3 months. He continued flying until April, completing his tour. The missions that followed felt emptier, no longer survival by invention, but procedure. Every gunner now elevated naturally. Success no longer felt like discovery, only repetition. When the war ended, official reports credited improved turret flexibility and revised engagement geometry for a 20% reduction in bomber losses. Reeves's name appeared nowhere. Years later, he would recall that final mission not as glory, but as adjustment, the moment when logic overruled fear. What had begun as frustration had become legacy, even if it wore the mask of bureaucracy. His filed groove on the turret had disappeared under factory polish, but its angle endured across the skies. In March 1944, an Air Force officer visited Thorpe Abbotts to review gunnery improvements. He asked for Reeves by name, shook his hand, and said, "Your method saved aircraft. That's all that matters." Reeves answered, "It wasn't a method, sir, just a mistake I didn't correct." The officer smiled faintly. "Most of our progress comes that way." By then, every bomber flying over Europe carried that mistake built into its guns. Each fortress that turned home through flak and fighters owed a sliver of survival to a machinist who refused to aim level. Reeves never claimed invention. He only understood what others had overlooked, that the difference between theory and survival was measured in a few silent degrees. When he left the service, the filed turret part was replaced, tagged "damaged by combat." No one kept it, yet the idea remained everywhere, etched into the manuals, the mounts, and the instincts of gunners who never knew his name. History would remember the bombers, the factories, the victories. But inside those victories was one unseen line, tilted slightly upward, drawn by a man who believed precision meant questioning the rules. On that winter day above Bremen, James Reeves had not been heroic. He had been correct, and that, in war, was rarer than courage itself. By spring 1945, the bombers no longer needed luck to reach Germany. The Luftwaffe had bled itself dry, its last sorties scattered and desperate. The sky that once devoured crews by the hundreds now felt empty, heavy with the echo of propellers long gone. At Thorpe Abbotts, the runways baked under a pale sun as the final missions ended. The fortress formations had grown too vast for memory, waves of silver that erased even their own shadows. Sergeant James Reeves watched from the perimeter road as Katie D., now stripped for parts, was towed toward the salvage yard. Her patched skin still bore faint smoke lines from that day over Bremen. To most men, she was obsolete metal. To him, she was proof that logic could defy death. The small notch he'd filed into her turret, a scar invisible to the eye, had altered the pattern of war. He stayed until dusk, then turned in his flight jacket and walked away without ceremony. The war's end was not triumph, but release. Instructors at gunnery schools now spoke casually of elevated lead correction, a phrase that carried none of its origin. Manuals cited field adaptation validated through operations. No one mentioned the machinist who had made it happen. Reeves never corrected them. When he returned to Ohio, the factory machines greeted him like old friends, predictable, deft, and precise. He adjusted drill heads, calibrated presses, and measured tolerances to fractions of a millimeter. Sometimes, as he watched a lathe spin, he caught himself thinking in arcs and trajectories again, the way a bullet curved through frozen air, the way the human mind could follow it farther than the textbooks allowed. Letters came from former crewmates scattered across America. Some ran farms, some built houses, one opened a small repair shop in Kansas. They wrote of quiet nights, dreams of engines, and the strange silence of safety. Reeves wrote back only once. "We made it home because the angle was right." It was all he could think to say. In 1946, an internal Air Force report credited the improved survivability of heavy bombers to refined turret geometry and psychological deterrence. Reeves read the summary in a veterans magazine and smiled. He remembered that hesitation in the eyes of attacking pilots, the split second when they couldn't tell if his tracers were closer than they seemed. Fear, he realized, could be engineered as precisely as steel. Years later, he visited an airfield museum in Suffolk. In a corner display sat a fragment of B-17 tail armor recovered from a field near Bremen. A curator explained that analysis showed unusual heat damage consistent with sustained fire at high elevation. The label called it an early harmonization experiment. Reeves said nothing. He simply nodded and traced his hand along the metal's edge. The idea had outlived him already. By the 1950s, the jet age had rendered everything slower obsolete, but the geometry remained. Gun turrets became radar scopes, tracers became guidance systems. The principle was unchanged: anticipate motion, lead the climb, aim higher than instinct. Reeves recognized it everywhere, even in machines that no longer used bullets. The war had moved on, but his angle survived inside it. He grew old without ceremony. His hands stiffened, his hearing dulled, yet his precision never faded. When his daughter found him one evening in the workshop asleep at his bench, she noticed one peculiar thing. The protractor clamped beside his vise bore a faint red mark scratched just above zero. She kept it, thinking it sentimental. She never knew it was the same angle that had saved 9 lives. When Reeves passed away quietly in 1989, no headline followed. His medals were ordinary, his service record brief, yet somewhere in every preserved B-17 turret, every museum, every film reel of formation fire, his defiance lingered. A nameless notch cut against the rules, measured not in glory, but in degrees. The war had been built on orders. Survival had been built on questions. And one winter morning above Bremen, a machinist's question had redrawn the sky. At dawn, long after the engines had gone silent, the old airfields of East Anglia still breathed with ghosts of aluminum and frost. Grass had reclaimed the runways, but beneath the soil slept fragments of glass, casings, and one invisible correction, a line drawn higher than anyone once dared. The manuals would later call it compensation. The historians would call it adaptation. But for one freezing hour over Bremen, it had been instinct, a machinist's rebellion against the neat geometry of death. Every bomber that crossed the channel after that day carried a trace of him, not in name, but in angle. Every tail gunner who tilted his barrels upward, every formation that came home when logic said it could not, was echoing that quiet defiance. Reeves's idea was never written on any medal or monument. It existed instead in the rhythm of flight itself, proof that survival could be engineered, not just endured. And when the last contrails faded from Europe's winter sky, what remained was not victory, but adjustment. A single notch in steel that turned a bomber into a fortress, and a stupid idea into a line that reached just high enough to touch history.